4, art school, page 152. Do we have a piece for the great report? Here we have Kalir in a much more accessible mode, but he also in this Kinot explores the vast discrepancy between the moments of Jewish history when God was closest, most intimate with us, and the Churban, which took us in the other direction and caused God to distance himself. However, what is remarkable about this Kinot, and as I said, there is the exploration of the psychological points of entry. This one is accusatory. It's asking, how could you do this v'lo zacharta, as if the Ribono Shel Olam's decision to bring about the Churban in all of its many iterations through the generations, as if it was the result of his forgetting who you're dealing with. How could you do this to us? The Rav says that indeed the whole concept of Eicha, and perhaps there is room to question this, but the Rav says that the entire concept of Eicha opens us to the possibility of questions of theodicy, which are uniquely permitted on Tisha B'Av. We're used to the idea that anyone can question God anytime they want, and that's sort of in the culture. But the Rav says it was much more restricted than that, and that Tisha B'Av it's a strange thing. You know that Tisha B'Av always falls on the same day as Pesach, right? And according to this juxtaposition, what do they share in common? They are both days which are ignited by questions, very different kinds of questions. Pesach starts with Manishtano Halayla Hazeh and notes the contrast between the things we do which are of slavery and the things we do which are of freedom. Tisha B'Av asks a different kind of kasha. There are many more than 4. Tisha B'Av asks the kasha, how could you move against us? How could you cause us this suffering and not remember that we are the ones who throughout history have been so close to you? Zachor Hashem meha yalanu asks the Ribono Shel Olam to go back to the other side. Remember meha yalanu, remember what we have had together, and restore us to that relationship.
Rabbi, isn't that like presumptuous? You spend the whole Haftorah where God says all the bad things he did and what he's going to do, and now when he actually does what he says he's going to do, you say, oh my God.
Well, this theme is also going to be explored, Jerry. But remember, when a person is first hit with suffering, it is almost impossible for them to become reflective and to feel that they may have had an active role in bringing this process about. The acceptance of one's own active role, and therefore the possibility of changing it, is actually a stage more advanced, because it means that you have come to feel some sense of personal agency, that you have a role to play. The first response to Churban is to be utterly flattened. And in that flatness, one doesn't have accessibility to a give and take. But that's a very good question. But we'll see that theme will be coming up, but only as, and the Kinos, as I say, the Kinos are in a kind of psychodynamic order. would be hard to imagine them, in a different Seder. In the psychodynamic order of the Kinos, the place we start is Echo Atzta.
השברת על חוזנך ולכן ביתינו זכור אדוני מהיולון ביוסי ושלווה יושבת בירושלים ובאנתו אביעתו עד על חוג שמיים.
The next kina is one which we have not done together in a number of years. You find it on page 96. Echot tifarti me rashosa yishlichu, appears in the Lookstein edition on page 254, in the Art Scroll on page 166. You'll notice that this is a rather extensive Kinot. It goes on for several pages, but it follows an acrostic, and it actually is one of Kalir's ambitious structural kinos. Now, just a brief word about that. Rebbe Elazar Kalir seems to have been a poet who we try to reconstruct his psychological profile. He was, in a sense, he was the Harry Houdini of liturgical poets. Houdini made his career by setting tasks for himself which were more and more impossible. He would bind himself, he would tie himself up and put himself in handcuffs and put himself in a box and have himself thrown in the ocean. Kalir takes upon himself to use certain sets of words. In other words, he'll use the acrostic from a particular section of Megillas Echa, and he'll incorporate those words to govern his acrostic. But using that word, he builds an entirely new structure around it. And if that weren't quite enough, in this one, for example, and this really begins to go to the theme, Jerry, that you mentioned, that it's not as if we haven't had warnings about what would result. And so he takes the lamentation, and he juxtaposes it. Takes the 22 letters of the alphabet, and the first 11 he uses the promises of the Tochacha and Bechukosai, in other words, the positive promises, fits them in. And then for the last 11 letters of the alphabet, he takes 11 phrases connected with the promises of punishment that also come from the Tochacha. And so what he's doing is that even on two levels, first of all, as Jerry says, philosophically, he's reminding us that there have already been ancient warnings about what would happen, so that the Churban takes place in a context. But even beyond that, he takes very familiar verses. The Chumash was very accessible, very familiar. He takes that and uses it to ground his more elaborate poetic enterprise, so that there are pieces of familiar text there for us to understand. I just point you toward one particular verse, if you wouldn't mind, all the way down with the letter Kuf. Kumi dofki shavi al domi. There is a kind of a dialectical process that goes on through the Kinos, but it's going to be very highly accentuated here. And that is, on one hand, Ribono Shel Olam's not listening. You're wasting your time. The doors of heaven have been shut. That was the very first image we had in Shavas Suru, where the poet says, Mishkan miskos diburai, sakoso Mishkan miskos diburai. You have shut down Mishkan, you've shut down the tabernacle from hearing. I was using the word sukkah, which usually means a place where Hashem takes us in His protection, right? It's a place of intimate connection. But now you have used it to sequester. We've lost our contact not only with the Mikdash here, which has been destroyed, we've lost our contact with the Beis Hamikdash Shel Mala, with the heavenly. In other words, forget it, we're shutting you down. But at the same time, even after you've been told, or perhaps a projection of the way you feel, events have spoken to you, after that, the last thing you are to do is to become silent. That's where we get Shifchi Kamayim Libeich, pour your heart out like water. And here in his iteration, when he gets all the way down to the letter Kuf, Kumi Dofki Shavi Al Domi, arise up, pound on the door, pray with passion, don't be quiet. Usani Ke'ov Me'eretz Kolech. Ke'ov is a fascinating word, and this is one of Kalir's trick snares. Ke'ov, if you read it the first time, reminds you of what word?
Pain.
Ko'ev. But he's using it Ke'ov. Ke'ov means like a ghost. Remember when King Saul goes to the witch of Endor and calls up the ghost of Samuel from the other world. Tani ke'ov me'eretz kolech. Your voice is dead, but bring it up like a ghost. Don't stop the process. In other words, this is in a sense, this is the license, this is the foundation of the whole enterprise of Kinot. Kinot is not simply the inventory of our losses. It is the beginning of rebuilding. And even though in the experience of pain, the experience of pain is at its heart a sense that we have been rejected by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, probably because we deserve it. but we are so down that no one is listening anymore. And to stop there would be the worst thing in the world. And so he says, you must find your voice again. And that's why we have the lesson, for example, in the Kinot, which we will recite with a little less interpretation, the one about that the prophet offers to his beloved king, Josiah. The Chazal who say that the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash was actually delayed for a number of years, for an entire generation. Why? Because a Kinot was offered for the death of this righteous king. In other words, Kinot is not merely a declaration of abject vacancy and loss. Kinot is a constructive act. And so this verse is a kind of a clarion call. Even though it feels like everything has been shut down, Meirosh Ashkeni Vihidmi, I was offered bitter waters, Rosh Vilana, right? Rosh is a kind of a bitter plant. I was offered bitter waters, Vihidmi, and I was silenced. Choshach Hiluchi Bin'um, and all of my pathways were darkened. Bin'um im telchu imi, from the words im telchu imi. He's quoting here again from the Tochacha. If you will walk with me, then you'll be all right. But if you don't, then everything will shut down. Choshach hiluchi means I wasn't able to walk. I can't walk anymore. And the same, again, paralysis, the reaction, and the encouragement to speak about the paralysis, speak about the pain, speak about the devastation, and through that, which is the process of Kinot, the hope can be
This is toward the end of this Kinot, and I think the quote is "V'im telchu imi v'keri."
right.
Yeah,
That's
bad stuff.
That's bad stuff. Okay, let's take this Kinot. It's rather lengthy, so we'll give you a couple of extra minutes. Try to stay focused on at least a few of the verses and see if this theme helps you.
Echa tifarti me'roshati hashlichu u'keneged pisei hakavod tzelem himlichu v'chalavam tanai asher chazai nim lafu v'nam im b'chukaitai telechu.
Come now to page 102, Kinot, which we have mentioned extensively in the past. Echa Eli Konenu Me'elov. This is the Kinot which actually fills in an imaginary, if you will, prosthesis for something which is mentioned in the Tanakh, but which is never elaborated. Namely, the Kinot that was offered by the prophet on King Yoshiyahu. And so the Kalir undertakes to tell us what that Kinot, what that elegy may have been like. And as I mentioned, it's one which had a good result, but it also takes us in a different psychological direction. Because as opposed to the Kinos which we've had before, which are taking their imagery from historical events, etc., this one is very much focused on a pious individual. This is focused on one of the most definitively saintly people in Jewish history. And whereas the theme of the failure of leadership is one which will be repeated many, many times, it goes all the way back, of course, into the Navi and to the book of Eicha itself, this Kinot represents the opposite. This is the failure, so to speak, of fellowship. This is a generation which betrayed a truly pious and gracious leader. And it's interesting, a theme to be developed on its own in some other context, the use of children in the whole literature of Kinos. This time, the first image that the elegist presents of this pious king, of this saintly king, Yoshiyahu, is Ben Shmona Shana Hechil Lidrosh Me'elav. First image we have of him is as an 8-year-old. An 8-year-old who grows up from a family where fidelity to the Almighty was not in his experience. And somehow, as a little boy of 8, he begins his search for God. Now, Lidrosh, of course, is a word which parses in two directions. Lidrosh Me'elav, one, it means to give droshos. He began to speak, but Lidrosh really means to seek. He began his search. And the Kinot turns on the 4th verse, Davak bo avon leitzeinei hador. The sins of the cynics of the generation cleaved to him. Because one of the things that happens to truly saintly leaders is they all pray to naivete. And people make use of their stature. They allow them to be the purveyors of good in the name of the corrupt power structure behind them. And so Yoshiyahu is the exemplar of this innocence, a person who made the mistake, although he believed in God, he made the mistake in also believing in the perfect sincerity of his generation. And he leaned on it. He said, we are a righteous people, therefore God owes us protection, even from the insult of having Egypt's Pharaoh simply cross across our land. And that's what happened. Paro Necho, who only asked for a rite of passage, was denied because Yoshiyahu was so confident that he had brought his people to a level of righteousness that the divine promise that no stranger will be allowed to cross your land, they owed it to us. We've achieved that. But the Leitzonei Hador, the cynics of the generation, behind his back, nothing had really changed. And the symbol that is used is that behind their doors they had the images of the idols, so that when the inspectors would come in, the house looked like a kosher, spiritually pure Jewish dwelling, and when they left, the doors closed, and there was the idol. There were the values that were the real center of the family's life. And the king in his naivete had no idea. And so the elegy to him is both to bring us in contact with the ultimate symbol of childlike innocence, who is the victim of the Churban, but also to remind us that it cannot only be about leaders. It has to be about the quality of the community of Israel which follows them. Page 102.
Israeli kanu melav ben shmona shnai chel rosh melav necham baravam chanu alav lo uzikar lo sigud nefalav gam chalav thing Israel shakam ligdor lo kam kamo mimosa vigdor davak v'chet leitzonador shakam achad elas lizdor.
Hofim zen shichon kizmarto.
Mosi kila yahili rashati v'rasati v'nutasholi.
The next Kinot that we will explore is also a new addition to our ranks. Page 104, Ohali Asher Ta'avto Ad Lo Bereshis. Find it also on page 300 in the Luxkin edition, page 188 in the Art Scroll. And if anyone has any other editions they'd like to announce, please feel free. In the paperback, Ohali Asher Ta'avto Ad Lo Bereshis is another Kalerian poem, and it is quite remarkable because what it really does is looks at the concept of Mikdash and hence the concept of Churban in a much broader sense. And it means that what is the Beis HaMikdash, or what was the Beis HaMikdash? The Beis HaMikdash was actually a kind of a concession which was modified and refined since the creation of the world. And the first Beis HaMikdash was the world, because the Almighty intended with the creation of Adam, He intended this world to be linked to the world above, and the concept of Mikdash actually preceded preceded the idea of Bereshis. He says, Ohali asher ta'avta ad lo Bereshis. You wanted a tent. Your dream of a tent, of a place of dwelling, even before the creation of the world, in kisei chavod v'tzarfo, to weld it, to bind it to your divine throne above. That's what this world was supposed to be. Lomo lanetzach shudad biyad shodedim. And so why is it devastated by robbers? V'neyesa karoeh v'otyo ra'ashta v'raganta v'ato malipo. And who are you hurting? In other words, the punchline in each of these stanza is that ultimately the loss of the Beis Hamikdash, the loss of a place in the world for God to dwell, is a loss to the Ribono Shel Olam himself. He himself is left without a home, without a context, without a place where he can be recognized. The atom malipo is, so what do I have here? In other words, what's left for me in the world if there is no mikdash? Then he goes to the other iterations. The second one is particularly beautiful. Ali asher komamto le'esane olam becherdas mi'efa. The tent that you, my tent which was established to the mighty ones of the world, which is an expression referring to the patriarchs and matriarchs of Israel, means that the second mikdash was after the sin in the garden. The Almighty had virtually given up hope of an intimate communion with his human creature. He just sort of threw in the towel until one person, Avraham Avinu, went looking for him and rekindled his hope that somewhere in this world there would be a place for him. And in the beginning, what was that place? That place was the home of Avraham Avinu. In that tent, people came to see the Ribono Shel Olam. That was the Beis Hamikdash. And that quality of the tent continued through the generations of the patriarchs. That's where Yaakov is called Ishtam, Yoshevo Alim. Rivka brings that quality to the tent of Isaac, the Shechina on the tent. And fascinating, the illusion that Kalir seeks to remind us of, Becherdas mi'efo. Cherdas mi'efo is the moment when, after Yitzchak Avinu has given the blessing to Yaakov, and it feels right, then Esav arrives, and Yitzchak trembles, right? And he says, mi'efo, then if that's Yaakov, if that's the blessing son, mi'efo, who is this? And that recognition that Esav is an intruder, that Esav defiles the tent, that he is not the person to be in the tent which is the mikdash. He belongs, he's the ish sadeh, he has a role in the world. But in the tent of Isaac, he is a force of defilement. That, the way Kalir sets it up, is the first moment, is the antecedent of the pagans piercing the Holy of Holies, bringing the Chazer into the Beis HaMikdash. That is the first time that we have the pagan in the sanctuary image, and it goes all the way back to Yitzchak Avinu, and that is the first Mikdash. And the Rav here pauses, and he says, we must never forget the capacity of the Jewish home to be the place where the Shekhinah resides. On one hand, one is reminded there are so many communities. There's so many communities that had a shul, that had a rabbi. But if that community had one home that welcomed people, especially young people, and let them see the beauty of Yiddishkeit, let them taste its sweetness. It was in those homes that the shul, by extension, became a mikdash ve'at. But the real mikdash, the makom shechina, was in those homes, and they are not necessarily defined by scholarship. The Rav uses this as a moment to provide his own private elegy for someone that he remembered from his childhood, Elia the carpenter. Elia the carpenter who, when he finished a piece of furniture, would recite the last verse of Sefer Tehillim, Kol HaNeshama Ta'alelko. The whole, every spirit, every soul in the world should praise God. Apparently in the hope that on that table, someone would celebrate Shabbos, someone would celebrate Yontif, someone would welcome guests. That table would be sanctified. And he says, the Rav says, that his father Zal used to tell him that he believed that Elia the carpenter was one of the Lamed Vav Tzadikim. If you want to know the greatness of the Rav and what its etiology was, it was because he was raised with this sensitivity, which goes back to Reb Chaim and before, the sensitivity not to only appreciate Gedolei Torah, the sensitivity to see the holiness of individual Jews, to see them and their homes as little Batei Mikdash. And when the Rav says these words of elegy about this simple Jewish carpenter who wasn't a scholar, but he knew the book of Psalms by heart, when he provides his elegy, you can see the Rav doing the computation in his mind. How many Reb Elias went into the ovens at the Shoah? How many Batei Mikdash were destroyed? How many homes that would have welcomed guests, that would have turned the next generation into people who loved God and His Torah? How many of those were destroyed? And you realize that Churban is something which, if you understand that making a place for God in the world is something which was never dependent on a single structure or a single building. It was a process which expressed itself in so many ways. And indeed, the very next paragraph, the third paragraph, Ali asher patzto limano litzir, the tent of the guide or the seeker. This is a reference to Moshe Rabbeinu. And he tells us that he's reminding us that even before there was a Mishkan, that in that period between the giving of the Torah and the establishment of the tabernacle in the desert, what was the Beis HaMikdash? The Beis HaMikdash was the tent of Moshe Rabbeinu. It was, and had everything, right? That's where the Aron Kodesh was. That was the center. That's where God came to speak to the people. And so, even as you move, you see the sweep here. That we move from the tent of the patriarchs, which is based upon humanity and generosity and kindness, and we move to the tent of Moshe Rabbeinu, which is based on the aspiration to the loftiest heaven-given ideas of the Torah. And we don't miss a beat. Each of those is a manifestation of Mikdash, of Hashras Hashchina, of the divine presence, and the loss of each is itself a kind of a churban. And so we continue to be able to follow the rest of these allusions as you read through the rest of the. Continue now with the Kinot, which pivots on one of the most shocking images. Pivots on one of the most shocking images in all of the book of Eicha itself, the notion of women cannibalizing their own children. Kinot, page 120, Im Tochalno Noshim Pirion Ulalei Tepuchim, is again Kalirian, and responds at each verse Alalaili, right? As if all of these things are examples of the terrible fate which has befallen Klal Yisrael. In other words, these are, so to speak, these are the films from the concentration camps, the film of the ghastly horror beyond imagination. Remember, Kalir didn't have photographs. I don't have to tell you that. He didn't have engraved pictures. He had to paint his pictures in words, and so the images that he conjures of people being burned alive in Tisrafno Shom Kol Osam Hanefoshos Kotzim Kesuchim, like dry thorn bushes. The metaphors are astounding. However, what is remarkable about this particular Kinot is the trapdoor ending, which snaps, because after all of these complaints against God, after all of these sequences of suffering, the Almighty gets to answer. And it's strange that in the whole enterprise of theodicy, what everyone wants is an answer. let God answer. But sometimes we wouldn't really be too happy to hear what he has to say. Because at the end here, the Rebbeinu Shalom gets his opportunity. Baruch HaKodesh Limulam Mar'im. The Holy One thunders in anger against them and says, Hoi! Al Kol Shechinai Hara'im. My wicked neighbors. Mashehu Kro'am Modi'im. They will tell you everything that happened to them. Be'ez asher asu lo modi'im. But they don't tell about what they did. Im tochalna noshim pirium mashmi'im. They will tell you about the famine so severe that women ate their own children. Im yeharei b'mikdash Adonai kohen v'navi lo mashmi'im. But they don't tell you about the priest and the prophet, which in this case is one person, and it's going to be referred to later, whom they allowed to be murdered in the sanctuary. That part of the story they conveniently left out. And so, responding to, again, Jerry, referencing your comment before, this sounds, to our ear, terribly negative. Because the truth of the matter is that contemporary people cannot bear the concept of punishment. The idea that anything happens because we did something, they're too fragile. They're too fragile, and their relationship with God is too distant. But then the elegist is actually moving the ball closer from the paralysis of the sufferer to the beginning of the notion that punishment is dialogic, that some of the things happen because we did wrong, and by inference we can do better and we can reverse the process, right? So here, alalai li is a trap. Because everyone along the way is saying, oh, woe is me, woe is me, woe is me. And li means I was the recipient. This all happened to me. I was an abject victim. I did nothing. And the Shekhinah comes along and says, excuse me, I think we're only hearing half the story. And begins to gradually shift the picture toward that notion of responsibility. Of course, responsibility is a shocking burden itself. However, it is also the beginning of a kind of a partnership where we have something to say. Okay, let's recite the Kinot
Safana, Basulas, Sabakawin, Sabal, Mali, Rough, Kodesh, Nubam, Marim, Oako, Shekanai, Harim, Mashah, Modian, Es Asher, Asu, Modian, in Takala Nashim, the Yam Mashim, in Nerak, the Mikash, Alanai, Koin Nabi, Mashim.
We move now to page 125. Arze Halavonon is the Tisha B'Av version of the martyrology of the 10 great sages who lost their lives. I'm not going to give extensive commentary because we've spoken about it quite a bit in the past, but its basic premise that certain kinds of sins, unredressed, move in a multi-generational process, and that sometimes the greater the leaders, the more they have to take responsibility for events that took place long before they came on the scene, and these events need to be redressed. In this case, they are called upon representing the brothers of Joseph, who sold him into slavery, as the tradition based on the pasuk in the Navi says, for a pair of shoes. Please, it's extremely vivid and clear, both in Hebrew and in English. Arze Halavonon, page 125, and the other pages, 414 in the Lookstein version, and 250 in the Art Scroll.
Arze Lebanon Adirei HaTorah Ba'alei Terisin B'Mishnah U'B'Gemara Borei Koach Amei Leha B'Tahara. Tzedek Yimoch Melech V'Shalmu Yimei Heplech Aro Misa V'Neilech.
Continue now on the next page. Harishim Imeni V'Adabeira. This particular passage in the Kinos is one which reflects a deep division in the ethics, morality of Ashkenaz and Sfarad. Because there was a period during the time of the Bali HaTosfos when one response to the predations of the Christian church was communities that actually committed mass suicide, where parents killed their children and then killed themselves. And already in the first line, you hear the terrible sense of inner conflict. Hacharishu mimeni ba'adabeira. Leave me alone, leave me in silence, and I will speak. V'yavor alai ma, whatever will become of me. Yavor alai ma almost sounds like he is in fear that what he is about to say is heretical or blasphemous, and that for expressing what is expressed in this Kinot, he will be liable to punishment. And indeed, there was tremendous debate, and you can't imagine higher stakes, as to whether the people who committed suicide under these circumstances, whether they were indeed heroes and martyrs, or whether they had violated the most sacred principles of the Jewish people, v'charta b'chayim. So their standing was in no way clear, and yet here in the Kinot we enter their thought process. We become one with them, at least on the threshold of the kind of desperation that could lead a person to such an act. And you hear their argumentation as they speak to their little children. Lo zachinu legadlechem lesora. God did not find us worthy to fulfill our aspirations to raise you up to study of Torah. V'nakrivchem ke'ola v'haktorah v'niske imochem le'ola. Atzefuna me'ein kol ve'aluma. We will offer you instead as a whole burnt offering and as ketoras, as an offering, as incense in smoke, and together with you we will be found worthy of the light. Playing under this concept is the notion of Uneshalmos Parim Sifosenu, that the Jew who is post-Churban is always in search of what Eliot would call an objective correlative, some way to replace the missing korbanos. And here you have these desperate people who are the descendants, 1 or 2 generations later, of Rashi, during the time of the Crusades, saying we wanted to raise our children to be students of Torah. And we were aware that through the study of Torah, they would study the laws of the Beis HaMikdash, they would study the sacrifices, and it would be counted to them as if they had offered the sacrifices. That's why we read the Korbanos every morning in the Tefillah, that through the study of them, the Shalma Parim Sifosenu, that speaking of them will make it possible for us to be as if we had offered them. Fill in the gap that is left by the loss of the Beis HaMikdash. And he says, well, we were never given the opportunity to raise children who would sit and learn the laws of the Korbanos. And instead, the children will be the Korbanos. And this will be what we offer in the gap, in the chasm of the missing Beis HaMikdash. We'll offer our children. And together with them, perhaps we will see the light. We know that the Beis HaMikdash was magically the source of light of all of Yerushalayim. They say that from the windows of the Beis HaMikdash, the light of the menorah illuminated all of Jerusalem. He's talking about the darkest possible time, and that perhaps because we will find our own way to offer the Korban Olah, the burnt offering, and to offer sweet smoke up to the Almighty as sacrifice, perhaps we will somehow be found worthy of regaining the light of the lost Beis Hamikdash. We continue now with one of the two kinos in which traditional melody plays a part. That is Eish Tukad B'Kirbi on page 144. If you're looking for it in the Lookstein edition, 514, and in the art scroll on page 306. And this, of course, is the kino which contrasts the majestic rejoicing when the Jewish people left Egypt freed by God, and its polar opposite, the grieving as they left Jerusalem.
Tevel, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Tohu Olim, Yarchol Digolim, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Ove Yishvelim, Machanos Arelim, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Yovel Shmito, V'Eretz Shoketa, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Ofulas Visus, V'Torus, V'Chostus, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Kapores V'Yoron, V'Avnei Zikonot, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. V'Avnei Akala, Uchlei Abala, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Levim v'Aronim v'Shivim Zikenim, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Nogusim v'Vonim v'Umuchrim v'Kolim, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Moshe Yir'einu v'Aron Yacheinu, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Nebuchadnezzar Yadrianus Keisar, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Na'arot v'chomov Adonai Shamo, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Rochak v'menu, Hine Einenu, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Sisrei poroches v'sidrei mareches, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Chemon iteches v'yoloi socheches, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Olos v'achim v'isheni krochim, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. V'chereb v'dukorim v'netzion ha'yakorim, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Marei mikvos l'chovot mikvos, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Shemikos v'suos v'kolos v'zvos, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Tzitz hazahav v'hamashel v'rahav, Tzeitzim Mitzrayim. U'shlach hanezer yopas v'ezer, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Kiddushon nevuah v'od Adonai yirah, Tzeitzim Mitzrayim. V'kolov morav v'ruach hatumah, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Rina v'Yeshua v'chatzot zeros ha'teruah, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Zakas olo v'nakas cholo, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Shulchan menorah v'chavil v'torah, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Eli v'soevo v'esel masevo, Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Tzeitzim Yerushalayim. Sos of the Simcha, Nos Kavana, V'shuvim Yerushalayim.
If you would join me on page 100, page 150, find it also on page 540 in the Lookstein, page 320 in the Art Scroll. This is another one of the new editions for this year. We are very, very much outside the field of Kalir and even of the medieval Ashkenaz. In this Kinot, we are in the hands of the master poet Yehuda Halevi, as we will be for Tzion HaTalot Tisha, the next one. This is very different from the Tzion poem. This time, Yehuda Halevi undertakes to poeticize, in a certain sense, to rewrite and to punctuate a famous midrash. The midrash is based on an episode which is recorded in the second book of Chronicles in Divrei Hayomim Beis, and it comes all the way from the time of the reign of King Yoash, where there was a certain high priest, Zechariah, who was, according to tradition, both the Kohen Gadol and the Navi. And in a certain year, when Yom Kippur fell on Shabbos, the Navi Zechariah was murdered on the altar in the Beis HaMikdash. And this because he had chastised the generation about their infidelity with idolatry, and they responded by slaughtering him. Of course, the way in which the Midrash is constructed, we're talking about the holiest person in the world, in the holiest place in the world, in the convergence of the two holiest times in the world, Yom Kippur and Shabbos. Talking about Kedusha manifest in its most complete form, and telling the people, come back, change your direction from the idolatry that you are embracing. And the fact that the Navi was murdered is only the first element in the story, because we are told that 2 centuries later, when the general of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuzaradran, who was the officer actually charged with the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, when he came into the Beis Hamikdash, he found fresh blood still, as it were, bubbling on the altar. And he asked, what is this? And all of this is going to be related in very accessible Hebrew by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. He asked, what is this? And the Kohanim of the time, this is an important line, said to him, oh, that's just the blood of Korbanos. But he wasn't satisfied with their answer. And so he took other Korbanos in a kind of a scientific test, and he shechted them, and he wanted to see, does the blood indeed behave that way on the altar? And of course, none of that blood seethed. And he realized that they had lied to him. And what was there was still the blood of the Navi. And the Gemara goes on there in the Midrash to relate the horrific events which followed, that group by group, from what one might consider the most powerful to the most vulnerable members of Jewish society, Nebuchadnezzar brought them and slaughtered them on the altar and said, is this enough? Can the blood stop boiling now? Almost as if he had a dialogue with the spirit of the dead Navi. And the blood continued to boil, and he continued to execute people on the spot. And the way the Midrash concludes, and here we may as well read it in the beautiful words of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in his reconstruction. We are told that at the end, Ad Asher, this is in the last paragraph, Ad Asher Nasan Nebuzaradran Libo Lashamayim, until he himself lifted his heart up to heaven, Vayomer, and he said, Ha'ein dai bivnos Yerushalayim, isn't it enough with these daughters of Jerusalem? Hakola ta'osa es she'eris hashivya, will you demand the destruction of all of those who have survived of the captives? In other words, the punisher himself becomes the voice. He becomes, in a sense, the makonim. He's the one who turns to God and said, I myself am sickened by the toll that you have exacted for this unrepented sin. I ask you for mercy. And with that, the blood ceases to boil. What is incorporated in this Kinot, and I think perhaps the one key phrase is the notion that the Kohanim of the time, Vaya'anu ki zeu dam korban hazevachim. This is nothing special. This is just the blood of our korbanos. What you hear in the Kohanim is the desire of people to let's just move on. Let's just forget this happened. 200 years of let's forget that an outrage happened here, that there is blood on this altar. We just want to move on. We want to pretend it didn't happen. That is the moment where the calamity actually comes to be visited upon the Jewish people. That is the moment when even the most innocent have become the carriers of the burden of the debt of that sin. The fact that once long ago, on the holiest day, in the holiest place, the holiest person whose only sin was that he spoke up against idolatry, that he was murdered, and that business went on as usual. That could not be forgotten. And the only voice that could speak for the Jewish people, because they had all been